The Big Empty in Old World Blues has to be up there for me as the creepiest place in Fallout New Vegas. But why? Why the Big Empty and not, say, the Sierra Madre with its ghost people and obvious horror vibes? It's the sheer breadth of horror that does it for me. The Big Empty has it all. Body horror, psychological horror, existential horror, liminal creepiness, you name it, there's something there. So I won't be covering absolutely every location of the Big Empty because we're going to take a look at what I've picked out as the creepiest bits. That'll be most places anyway, to be fair, but first, what exactly is the Big Empty? Well, it is a vast, remote crater in Nevada's desert that once housed a pre-war research center. It used to be called Big Mountain because, well, it existed inside a big hollowed out mountain, but after an accident destroyed the mountain itself, it became the Big Empty. In Fallout New Vegas' DLC Old World Blues, the courier is lured here by a mysterious radio broadcast, but what they find is less big science and more a labyrinth of madness. Isolated from the world by a deadly radar fence, the Big Empty is completely cut off, a place where nothing exists beyond its mountainous boundary. The eerie isolation sets the stage for the DLC itself. No normal laws or ethics apply here, and the scientists who remain have become utterly unmoored from reality. So Big Mountain, through its transformation into the Big Empty, literally became a wasteland for pre-war science, a memorial to old world hubris. It was supposed to be a cutting-edge centre where no problem existed which could not be solved. In practice, however, it was a graveyard of failed experiments. So now that you know what the Big Empty actually is, let's take a tour of the crater's horrors, from the cyborg scientists of the think tank to the mangled test subjects in the labs. And make sure to stick around to the end of the video, where we're going to look at what I think is the wildest and creepiest example of cut content in the entire Fallout franchise. But first, thank you for being here, and I want to remind you all once again, as I've done on many of these videos, that the algorithm is a fickle beast and engagement is everything. So you can help me massively by liking, hyping, commenting, all the good stuff, and if you want more of this content, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. In the next 12 months, I'm aiming to try and reach at least 50k subs, so every single person who clicks counts towards that goal, and of course, check out the rest of my videos too once you sub. It would be remiss of me not to mention my channel members and Patreon supporters too for helping me to do this full time, so thank you. So with that out of the way, to start off, we're going to take a look at who actually runs the Big Empty. At its heart sits the think tank, a domed complex and the brains, literally, of the operation. Pre-war, this was the administrative core of the Big Mountain Research and Development Center, where the brightest scientists on payroll pushed through whatever projects military and private contractors would pay for. After the bombs fell, the 5 remaining executives agreed to something far worse than death. Dr. Klein's plan to extract their brains and implant them into robotic shells so they could continue their work indefinitely. It was Klein who argued that becoming brain bots was the logical way to survive and keep Big Mountain's research alive. In theory, they shed the weaknesses of flesh and became pure intellect. In practice, they became pinned exhibits in their own lab, reduced to disembodied voices and flickering monitors, curators of horrors they barely remember creating. Outside the dome, the think tank is ringed by its defences. Lobotomites, once human test subjects, now reduced to mindless workers, stumble through maintenance routines and perimeter patrols. Above them, banks of radar dishes and transmitters form the so-called radar fence, a perimeter of repulsion fields and broadcasts that keep the crater sealed and fry anything that attempts to cross it. As far as the doctors are concerned, the Big Empty is the world. Nothing beyond the crater can be trusted. Nothing beyond the crater truly exists. That belief isn't an accident. Sometime after their transformation, Dr. Mobius, once one of them, decided that letting these people roam the post-war world with their technology would be catastrophic. Using his own access to their systems, he hacked their robotic shells, corrupting their chronometers and navigation routines, erasing their memories of pre-war America and the wider world, and locking their minds into a recursion loop. They kept their intelligence and their egos, but not their context. He then fled to the Forbidden Zone and began broadcasting threats back at them, reinforcing the story that the world outside the Big Empty is nothing but death, and that he is an existential enemy waiting beyond the dome. So that's an interesting story and all, but what's the horror here with the members of the think tank? For me, it's all to do with the loss of their humanity when becoming brainbots and the effects that it had on them. Klein, the one who originally made the decision, seems clearly unstable. As chief head researcher of logistical operations and ideology, he still behaves as if he is the unquestioned authority in the room, but he no longer understands much of the technology that remains in the Big Empty. He is loud to the point of aggression, his voice volume stuck at an absurd level, his dialogue literally shouted, and he treats every suggestion from his colleagues as an annoyance or a challenge to his status. He censors or ignores evidence that contradicts him, and when it comes to his attitude, it feels as if in some latent way he knows, despite forgetting, that he's responsible for causing this situation the think tank find themselves in. Mobius seems to hint regarding Klein that he's lost the memory of his friendships, which would explain why he's so rude to everyone, his colleagues included. In his previous life, he headed a flagship research division. Now he is a panicking bureaucrat in a tin can, barking orders he doesn't fully grasp while insisting that he is still the head of everything that matters. Ostensibly, he's a broken remnant of a man. And Dr. 8 is what happens when you take an acoustician and remove his voice. Before the war, his speciality was sound, signals, harmonics, sonic equipment, and that obsession has survived in distorted form. After an encounter with Elijah damaged or reprogrammed his voice module, he lost the ability to speak normally. In conversation, he emits Robco sound waves rendered as gibberish symbols and subtitles. The think tank seems to prefer him this way. Even his fellow think tank colleague Dalla remarks that they like 8 without the capacity to speak properly. His particular flavour of lonely brain-in-a-jar fate is one where his only outlet is a confused, distorted signal, quite literally losing his voice. And where 8 is sound, Dr. Boris is teeth and claws. Officially the head of animology, beastology, and DNA scrambling technology, he is responsible for the creation of the Night Stalkers and Cazadors. And he still boasts that they are sterile and contained within the Big Empty, even when confronted with evidence that they have spread across the Mojave and into Zion. His pre-war backstory leaks into his work, a bullied prodigy at American High, humiliated by classmates and abandoned by his crush, with only his dog Gabe as a genuine friend. Given authority and a lab, he turned that dog into a cyberdog test subject, dosing him with drugs like Psycho and cutting him apart piece by piece. We'll be taking a closer look at this later. Post-war, Mobius wiped his memories and trapped him in the same recursion loop as the others, but the sadism remains visible in the present. Even when a quest allows him a moment of remorse over Gabe's treatment, the feeling is quickly pushed into the loop and forgotten. The man who once competed with Vault-Tec for the best way to get human test subjects now sits above an entire crater filled with his animal experiments, unable or unwilling to see how far they've spread. Dr. Dalla's reaction to replacing her body with metal, by contrast, was her discovery that she can't stop thinking about flesh. Formerly the head chief researcher of mineralogy and medical sciences, she now insists that she holds more than 200 doctorates in fields that don't exist, including humanology and holotape eidetics. Mobius's memory tampering left her with a heightened obsession with the human form. She talks about studying your biorhythms and watching you breathe, and describes lobotomites as teddy bears. Her dialogue flicks constantly between clinical analysis and barely concealed flirtation. She offers to gently lobotomize you from behind. In Dala, her transformation has taken her old world clinical detachment and turned it into something rather predatory. Dr. O is the group's robotics specialist and its designated punchbag. A pre-war executive and engineer with a genuine gift for constructing and deconstructing machines, he now spends most of his time defending his own name. Everyone else calls him Dr. O, reading the character on his shell as a letter rather than a zero. His irritation at this is constant and petty, but underneath it is something deeper. Of all the think tank, he seems most aware that his colleagues don't respect him. He's mocked by Klein, needled by Boris, and treated as expendable. His hatred for Robco and Robert House is so intense that he built Muggy, the neurotic, swearing mug-cleaning appliance in the sink, as a parody of Securitron design, and he reacts badly at the mere sight of a Pip-Boy. His What's in a Name quest revolves around the courier literally helping him reclaim the idea that he is a zero, not an O. It's kooky on the surface, but in the context of the think tank's horrific transformation, it emphasises how fragile their fractured identities are. These are brains in jars clinging to thin threads of reality like typography to feel distinct. Taken as a whole, the think tank are damaged personalities, stripped of their history and ramped up on mentats and paranoia, trapped in a sealed chamber and forced to bounce off each other for decades. Their constant bickering, Klein shouting down disagreements, O snapping back with sarcasm, Boris reverting to high school grudges, Dala drifting into anatomical monologues, and 8 reduced to angry bursts of sound can only be seen as a symptom of confinement, even if they don't fully understand what's going on. A part of the horror of the think tank is that these deranged, barely human husks are the ones who now define the Big Empty's bizarre reality. They send the courier into lethal facilities to retrieve equipment they no longer understand, insist on the importance of projects whose original purpose they've forgotten, and react to any suggestion of any change with fear and terror. Under Mobius's influence, they have refused to shut anything down or allow any experiment to be safely concluded. Every lab in the crater sits in a state of deliberate non-resolution, force fields still active, prototypes still running, monsters still breeding, automated systems still firing off directives decades after their operators died. In trying to preserve their genius, Klein condemned the think tank to a kind of intellectual undeath. They are technological liches. They cannot leave, cannot remember who they were, and cannot stop the machinery they once set in motion. The Big Empty is frozen in an extended crisis because its rulers are immortal, terrified and stuck in a loop, brains in chains, circling the same arguments while the crater below them fills with the horrific consequences. So we've taken a look at the human cost for the think tank, but what about the human cost for a large cohort of their victims, the Lobotomites? We could describe them as maybe their most grotesque servants, formerly human beings now reduced to hostile cyborg shells. Lobotomites are the end result of medical experiments at the Big Empty carried out on both former residents of the facility and unfortunate wanderers dragged in from the Mojave by robotic drones. Once captured, they are taken to the Big Empty's medical systems and subjected to a pretty horrible procedure. All major organs are replaced with electronic equivalents, and the original organic brain is removed and substituted with advanced Tesla coils wired into their nervous system. Originally, this routine was designed to be clever. The sink's autodock was meant to create inhabitants who could still move around in human bodies and thereby bypass the radar fence, while their brains, the new Tesla coil cores, allowed remote-controlled operation. In theory, Lobotomites were supposed to function as obedient, cognitively intact cyborgs that could maintain the crater in secret. In practice, a flaw in the autodoc's programming meant that every captive process had their brain lobotomized or completely destroyed, leaving nothing behind but feral aggression. Generations of victims were mutilated into these horrific forms before the courier ever arrived. The first truly successful brain extraction the machines manage in over 2 centuries is the courier's own. What remains shuffling around the Big Empty is a population of automated bodies running on damaged routines. Their Tesla brains keep the bodies moving and fighting, but whatever personalities they used to have are gone.
Dr. Dalla calls them skinvelopes, a word that makes their condition sound like a kind of packaging, skin as an envelope wrapped around automated machinery. These bodies have been repurposed as cleaning units, carrying out maintenance and gathering junk. That impulse spills into their layers, as we will look at in more detail later. They are actively hostile to anything alive and can fight alongside other lobotomites with brutal efficiency, often attacking in packs of 3 with a mix of melee and ranged weapons. Their voices are mostly reduced to grunts, but occasionally one forces out a strangled word, like fragments of language scraping past ruined vocal patterns. Dalla's own observations are worse. She records that in 43% of cases, when two lobotomites are left alone together, they will either fight for dominance or do things that YouTube won't allow me to even say. Think about that for a second. The think tank treats this as data. The reality is closer to behavioural collapse, a pair of ruined humans cycling between violence and compulsive contact, if that makes it clear what I'm implying. Visually, they look halfway between patients and cadavers. They typically wear torn hoods and respirators strapped to their faces, headphones clamped over their ears, and opaque goggles covering eyes ringed in blackened skin. When they die with their eyes closed, the dark tissue can make it appear as though the eyes have been gouged out entirely, and the surgery scars around their skulls make it clear what has been done to them. Their clothing, lobotomite jumpsuits and patient gowns, offer very little protection, yet the surgical modifications to their bodies leave them significantly tougher than normal humans. Even low-level lobotomites can soak up a surprising amount of punishment, and by the time the courier is higher level, they can be carrying hunting revolvers, brush guns, or proton axes that make them genuinely dangerous. They are everywhere. Lobotomites spawn across the Big Empty and keep respawning even after Old World Blues is completed, turning them into a permanent, self-renewing underclass of the crater. They appear in labs, at test sites, in lonely clusters on platforms and walkways. Lobotomites are the Big Empty's core body horror made literal. This is what the think tank does to people when there are no constraints: strip out the self, wire in a power source, and set the body to work indefinitely. Dalla coos at them as toys and study subjects. Klein barks orders at them through the dome's announcements as if speaking to badly trained janitors. But the fact is this: each shambling figure is a unique person who is taken apart. Now we're going to take a look at the creepy locations of the Big Empty, and our first stop is the X8 Biomechanical Testing Facility. This was where Big Mountain pushed biomechanics, infiltration technology, cybernetics, behavioural conditioning, and unsupervised robotics into a single experiment. Before the Great War, X8's flagship research involved building and testing cyberdogs. Dr. Boris took control of the program, and in a decision that encapsulates Big Mountain's ethos of science without restraint, he used his own pet, Gabe, as a test subject. Years of experimentation turned the dog into a cybernetic creature, transformed into a heavy, armour-framed hybrid whose original identity exists only in fragmented terminal notes. By 2281, Gabe still lives, if living is the right word, sealed in a cave attached to the facility's residential test wing. The chamber where he prowls was clearly never meant to hold an animal for decades. If anything, the chamber and the entire lab, rather than being a habitat or place of learning and innovation, is in practice a mausoleum of macabre experiments left running long after the researchers had died. But Gabe was only one strand of X8's work. Another branch involved infiltration testing, or that was the official justification. In reality, a large portion of the facility was shaped into a mock American high school modelled loosely on Boris's own high school, American High. It exists as the scientists wanted to test for ways to detect communist infiltration in an apparently believable environment. When the courier arrives, they discover a deserted in terms of normal human life, spooky school filled with protectrons, security turrets, and cyberdogs. The environment is recognisable enough as a seemingly normal high school to be unsettling and liminal. There are little details that deepen the atmosphere of surreal dread. On a wall, the phrase "Why me, Mobius" has been spelled out using physical letters like a desperate message. While the place might be empty of human life, it may harbour ghosts. There were victims here. One of the most violent chapters of X8's history was caused by Night Stalkers. A shipment mix-up delivered the creatures in place of standard dogs. Once released into the testing area, the creatures immediately massacred the facility's shipping department. The area was locked down, but Night Stalkers continued to wander the corridors long after containment collapsed. That sense of chaotic, unfinished science permeates every corner of X8. One of the most disturbing things in the entire building, the splicing facility, remains fully functional. The think tank built it to combine test subjects, dogs, robots, lobotomites, night stalkers, and left it running long after the Great War. The courier can access its splicing terminal where the results play out in real time on the metal platform behind the glass. Every outcome is just plain wrong. The attempt to splice a dog with a lobotomite produces a dismal failure, two bodies warped together and dropped in a heap, both severely mutilated, neither recognisable as what they were moments before. A robot Night Stalker splice fares no better. The creature staggers into existence, a robo-brain fused with an unusual specimen, moves erratically, then begins firing its laser at the walls before self-destructing. Nothing in its final seconds suggests conscious control. The lobotomite robot hybrid is the worst. When created, the new robo-brain speaks, clearly, fluently, and with the confusion of someone dragged out of a dream. It barely has the time to realise it exists, musing about the opportunities awaiting a dreamer like itself, and then it explodes. X8 is a great example of liminal and body horror, but we're only scraping the surface of what the Big Empty has to offer. Our next destination, Little Yangtze, sits behind fences and razor wire in the northwest of the crater, a bleak grid of tents, collapsed structures, and graves. On the surface, it looks like a forgotten POW camp, but the truth is far worse. This was officially an Executive Order 99066 Internment Center, one of many across the United States used to imprison Chinese and Chinese-American civilians during the Sino-American War. But while other camps followed harsh military protocol, Little Yangtze was diverted into Big Mountain's orbit, and that was not a good thing for the inmates. The moment the first 3 trainloads of prisoners arrived, the think tank executives repurposed the camp into what they openly described as a human farm. They viewed the inmates not as human beings but as test subjects, bodies to be pulled apart, brains to be extracted for robo-brain research, and unwilling participants in hundreds of dark experiments. Soldiers forced prisoners to carry out commands. Complaints about disappearances were dismissed by the camp commandant as superstitions and punished with weeks of solitary confinement. Prisoners tried to escape constantly. Each attempt ended the same way: processing, vanishing, or punishment. The guards' morale deteriorated as triple shifts and repeated incidents wore them down. Eventually, the commander requisitioned new technology from Big Mountain for a trial run: prototype explosive collars, the forerunners of the Sierra Madre devices. Every inmate in the camp was fitted with one. Crossing the perimeter meant instant death. It stopped escapes but turned the camp into something close to a slaughterhouse. When the bombs fell, the military fled Big Mountain, but they did not unlock the gates. The prisoners were left trapped within the fence, still collared. Radiation seeped in. Over the decades, the survivors were slowly ghoulified, becoming the wandering, hollow-eyed Yangtze camp survivors who paced the tents in 2281. Some lost the will to live, rushing the gates in fits of desperation that ended inevitably in detonation. 2 prisoners, number 27 and 34, somehow managed to escape the perimeter before 2281. They remain in the hills overlooking the camp, standing vigil over a place they could escape, but that they could not save. Centuries later, Elder Elijah found the Big Empty while searching for weapons to fuel his war against the NCR. Little Yangtze became his base of operations. In the watchtower, a cramped, rusted structure overlooking the camp, he set up a bomb collar workshop surrounded by deactivated collars, broken detonators, and a half-finished layer laser weapon prototype. Here, he reverse-engineered the collars fitted to the ghouls, exploiting the survivors as test subjects to identify the frequency he needed. Each failed attempt meant an explosion. The prisoners became tools again, just as they had been before the Great War. Elijah simply picked up where Big Mountain left off. Then came Christine Royce of the Circle of Steel, hunting Elijah for his crimes. She tracked him to the watchtower, found a vantage point in the ruined building opposite, and waited. Elijah spotted her when sunlight glinted off her scope. When she finally took her shot, it failed. Elijah retaliated by forcing several survivors to charge her position. Their collars detonated the moment they crossed the perimeter. The blasts knocked Christine unconscious. His robots collected her body and carried her to the Y17 Medical Facility, where her fate diverged into another horror entirely. For our next stop on the tour, you're in for a grim time because we're going to follow Christine to her destination. And over and above the terrible things that happened to Christine there, the Y17 Medical Facility is also where one of Big Mountain's most infamous mistakes came to be. Before the Great War, the medical facility was dedicated to developing the Y17 Trauma Override Harness, a full-body mechanical suit designed to track down injured soldiers, pick them up, and carry them to safety. On paper, the concept was revolutionary. Early field tests even looked promising, and the research team began designing upgrades that would allow the suits to mimic a wearer's physical behaviour, even operating discarded weapons if battlefield conditions demanded it. But the harnesses had critical design flaws. They struggled to determine the point at which an injury should trigger evacuation behaviour. Without a programmed home base, they would wander aimlessly once activated, and most disturbingly, the suits could not distinguish the wounded from the dead. Researchers accepted this as a tolerable limitation, reasoning that corpse retrieval had military value too. In retrospect, this concession feels like the first step on a slope that ends with one of Old World Blue's most horrifying stories, which we'll look at shortly. But first, we'll take a look at the facility's medical care, if we can call it that. After the war, the facility remained active, and as we heard earlier, Christine Royce was ambushed by Elijah and dragged to the facility unconscious. When she regained consciousness, she found herself in a medical centre operated entirely by machines. The Mr. Orderly Mark IV units, including the uniquely deranged Dr. Orderly MD PhD DDS, had continued their routines long after their human overseers vanished. With no one left to reprogram them, they became a closed loop of medical procedures with no ethical boundaries and no comprehension of harm. It was here that Christine underwent prolonged electroshock procedures and neurological experimentation. The systems in the facility were built to treat trauma, but with no oversight, they simply repeated invasive protocols until they caused permanent damage. The end result of this medical intervention was that Christine lost her ability to read and write, though she retained her higher reasoning and mathematical ability. Moving back to the trauma harnesses developed at the facility, there are blessedly none of them patrolling Y17 despite Christine's own reference to suits still operating in the area. They're a particular brand of horror that we'll explore in more detail on the next stop of our tour. The horror with what happened to Christine is of a different flavour. A medical installation that survived every human who worked in it, tending to procedures that no longer have meaning, are actually harmful, and performing them on anyone unfortunate enough to enter its reach. Moving on to the next stop, the X12 Research Center, we're going to explore the story relating to the Y17 trauma harness research that we alluded to earlier. Before the Great War, X12 was responsible for testing an advanced prototype of the Y17 Master Trauma Harness. The harness was worn by a test subject named Mr. Harris, and for a time the research team believed they were close to getting a handle on automated battlefield extraction technology. But the flaw at the heart of the Y17 program emerged here in its purest and most horrifying form. Harris died in the suit not through some kind of catastrophic injury, but by accidentally choking on a buffalo gourd seed. When his heart stopped, the harness's onboard systems registered only severe trauma and immediately activated its emergency protocols. Instead of shutting down or calling for assistance, it attempted to evacuate him using full mechanical force. With no capacity to distinguish death from injury and no programmed destination, the suit entered a corrupted state, a walking armoured corpse. And this corpse turned on the research staff almost immediately. One of the researchers sent a desperate appeal for help to the X8 team. In response, they dispatched a K9000 cyberdog gun for defense. But even that contingency collapsed. The staff member carrying it tripped in the confusion, dropping the weapon. At that moment, the researchers realized the lab was lost. They sealed the building and abandoned it, leaving the master harness alone inside with the body it was unable to acknowledge was dead. When the courier returns to X12 in 2281, the Y17 Master Trauma Harness is still wandering, endlessly repeating its corrupted extraction routines, still carrying Harris's long decayed corpse. It attacks on sight, not out of malice, but because its concept of rescue and threat have collapsed into the same behaviour loop. Killing it does not end the nightmare. Destroying the master harness triggers a defensive response. 3 Y17 trauma override harnesses spawn at the front entrance. These are simply more suits acting on the same flawed logic. The body horror of X12 is almost beyond comprehension. It's the place that spawned one of the creepiest enemies ever seen in gaming, a corpse walking under mechanical instruction, unable to stop, unable to rest in death, entirely uncontrollable. A rotting automaton driven by cold, machine, logic. Horror aside, there is one fun detail in X12 that only appears if the Wild Wasteland trait is enabled. In that case, the Y17 Master Trauma Harness repeatedly utters a single phrase, "Hey, who turned out the lights?" a reference to the Doctor Who episode Silence in the Library. And with that brief moment of levity amongst the horror, we're going to move on to the next stop on our tour. Tucked into the northern cliffs of the Big Empty, the X22 Botanical Garden is the place where Big Mountain's science crossed into outright biological catastrophe. Here, pre-war botanists engineered plants for military agriculture, pushing growth far beyond natural limits. In the process, they created Beauveria mordicana, a fungal organism intended as a pest control agent. This was later transferred to Vault 22, where it infected the entire population, turning the Vault's residents into spore carriers and causing the Vault's full collapse. Inside X22's garden today, the consequences are everywhere. Spore plants line the walkways, and spore carriers shuffle between tanks. The facility's unique monster, Patient Zero, lurks here too. It's the first human to be infected by the Beauveria strain. What makes X22 so disturbing is that it's the source of something that could, if let loose, literally destroy the environment of the entire continent, if not the entire planet. Depending on what you decide with Vault 22, you can witness the beginning of that end yourself in the base game. In X22, flipping back from end results, you can literally come face to face with Patient Zero, where it all began. There's a grim inevitability to the whole thing, a helplessness maybe. You're there at the source, but there's nothing you can do about it because it's already escaped containment. Moving further east, we find another example of genetic engineering without restraint. Two adjacent facilities, the Z9 Crotalus DNA Preservation Lab and the Z14 Pepsinade DNA Splicing Lab, form the biological core of Dr. Boris's work. Z9 is Boris's shrine to rattlesnake DNA. The idea was to preserve the genetic line by inserting it into stronger hosts. The result is the genesis of one of Fallout New Vegas's most notorious predators, Night Stalkers. The lab is host to a lot of evidence of its creations. The entrance leads to cells full of egg clutches, blood pooled beneath metal grates, and cages that look torn open from the inside. Shadis wanders the complex as a unique specimen. The lab is basically a series of holding pens for something that couldn't be held. It's more the predator's den now than the lab it used to be. Science kicked off the process, nature finished the job. And if C9 is an out-of-control nature-dominated nest, then Z14 is a hive. This is where tarantula, hawk and wasp DNA was spliced into new hosts, creating the hated cazadors. I doubt there's a Fallout New Vegas player on Earth who's forgotten their first encounter with those. The crazy thing is, they're not failures or accidents. Cazadors were actually intentional. The lab's notes explicitly credit Dr. Boris for their creation. From the entrance, the horror is instant. The floor is littered with piles of mutilated body parts, as if test subjects were dragged apart rather than dissected. Cazadors buzz above the lower levels. Breached containment cells line the walls, some with dead researchers inside. One such cell contains nothing but a skeleton clutching a laser rifle, barricaded behind a half-closed door as though they tried to hold out until the end. Behind the main heavy door is the medical lab, home to Specimen 73, a unique cazador whose sheer danger and aggression are, if you can imagine it, way worse than even a normal specimen. Together, Z9 and Z14 present the same nightmare, predators that now breed independently inside the Big Empty and have even escaped to plague the wasteland. Moving on, the Z38 Lightwave Dynamic Station is home to some of the Big Empty's subtler horrors. The place holds the memories of what its staff were feeling when the world ended, and none of it was healthy. Pre-war, this station developed the hologram projectors destined for the Sierra Madre casino. Frederick Sinclair, the casino's architect, pushed the team far beyond entertainment work, demanding security-grade holograms equipped with lethal defensive protocols. But the project took a stranger turn the moment Sinclair ordered a perfect hologram of Vera Keyes. A surviving terminal entry from one of the Z38 physicists captures the emotional corrosion plainly. Spending a lot of hours getting the Vera Keyes hologram looking right. I'm a physicist, not a sculptor. Iterating on her facial features and her dress to match Sinclair's expectations, it's about enough to make me file a complaint. I don't get the sense that Sinclair's doing this out of love or, well, lust. Somewhere along the line he became cold about the whole matter, as if crafting the hologram just right was something he hated. Obviously, the engineers didn't understand the request. They didn't see love, fixation, or longing. What they did see was a man becoming increasingly cold, increasingly demanding, as though he resented both the woman he was memorializing and the task of preserving her. That emotional discomfort hangs over Z38 like a cloud. And did you see what I did there? Cloud, Sierra Madre. Anyway. By 2281, the facility is abandoned mid-process. Two non-hostile holograms still drift the corridors like ghosts, walking loops through dusty rooms. There's a lone photograph of Vera Keyes, a reminder that the people building these illusions questioned the intentions behind them, but kept working anyway. The centre of the station is illuminated by a blue projection beam, the active test column used to calibrate hologram matrices. Stepping into it causes the courier's vision to lurch and collapse, with 12 hours passing instantly. Everything here feels like where dark plans were made. The courier, of course, finds out the fate of Vera Keyes when running the Dead Money DLC.
But the inclusion of this facility in Old World Blues gives this a bit of insight into the creepiness of the process to create her eternally drifting and plaintive holographic form that still inhabits the Sierra Madre. And speaking of the Sierra Madre, west of the Big Empty's central plateau lies the source of the main scourge of the aforementioned casino and resort. Unlike the Predator Labs or malfunctioning robotics bays, the Z43 Innovative Toxins Plant was the birthplace of something that kills and maims through the simple act of breathing. This is the place where Big Mountain developed chemical agents poisonous to humans, the origin point of the Sierra Madre's cloud, and by extension the absolutely awful ghost people who wander its ruins. Pre-war, Z43's scientists specialised in synthesising new toxins with both military and industrial applications. When the think tank executives struck a bargain with Frederick Sinclair, trading cutting-edge technologies like Y17 autodocs in exchange for Sierra Madre funding, Z43 became deeply, disastrously entangled in the casino project. Sinclair believed he was purchasing innovation, but what he actually bought was a live fire test range with the inhabited Sierra Madre villa as the proving ground. Staff at Z43 knew the ethical line had vanished. They openly objected to using a populated place as an experimental site, and they were horrified when an early leak of Z43's chemical agents was quietly exploited by the think tank executives to pitch new prototype hazmat suits as a solution. Those suits, themselves untested products of Z43, were given to villa workers who had no idea they were participating in a medical trial. Z43's own terminal entries compare these workers to the Chinese prisoners at Little Yangtze forced into experiments against their will. Sinclair, reassured by the initial results, ordered more suits, more chemicals followed, and in time the plant's toxins were the primary drivers of the Sierra Madre's transformation. The corrosive cloud, the chemical burns, the lingering mist, and the eventual creation of the ghost people. The interior of the plant feels grim, radiation bleeds through the place. There is the corrosive glove, a piece of experimental equipment sitting near the entrance. And when you thought the atmosphere couldn't get any bleaker, picking it up triggers up to 7 Y17 trauma override harnesses that terrifyingly burst out on you. Other than that, the facility is comparatively quiet, its work completed centuries ago. The nightmare it had a hand in creating is external, miles away at the Sierra Madre, where its toxins still swirl endlessly in the air, still animate the dead, still eat lungs and skin and metal. North of Z38 and west of the toxins plant, the Big Empty suddenly goes full liminal. The landscape opens into something that feels like a deserted alien ruin. This is the X66 Hexcrete Archipelago, a field of towering hexagonal pillars, hundreds of tons of experimental concrete arranged in patterns that defy logic. They rise at uneven heights, some only knee-high, others several stories tall. Hexcrete was meant to be a revolutionary construction material but did not meet expectations. All that remains are these dead monoliths. There are no doors, no control panels, no infrastructure to suggest anyone ever worked here. The pillars simply stand, scattered across a toxic piece of land. The courier can walk around, circle the structures, and still come away with no sense of what they were meant to become. That sense of purposelessness is what makes X66 feel spooky. The Big Empty's other facilities, however deranged, follow a traceable scientific theme. X66 does not. There is no obvious narrative structure. The monoliths feel less unfinished project and more forgotten mystery. The archipelago is not empty either. To add further to the creep factor, Y17 trauma harnesses wander between the pillars, their movements concealed by the concrete grid until they suddenly appear at your flank. The pipes surrounding the site are laced with frag mines, giving the impression that someone once tried and failed to secure the area.
Packs of night stalkers roam the fringes. To the north, hostile robo-scorpions from X13 sometimes pick up movement and descend the slope, turning the archipelago into a crossfire of monsters. Amidst the concrete forest lies evidence of a small piece of humanity long ago. A bedroll, a duffel bag, a camera, and a skeleton slumped in the dust. No notes, no context. Whoever they were, they died here, and that's all we know. The weirdest part is how liminal it all feels. The pillars have no use, yet they dominate the horizon, cold and geometric, like the remains of some abstract civilization. It feels accidentally eldritch, a construction experiment that birthed a landscape left standing in silence while surrounded by abject chaos. And talking of chaos, we're going to take a look at the living conditions of the Lobotomites. And to be honest, those living conditions embody the word deranged. The Cuckoo's Nest is the name of this settlement, if we can even call it that. Tucked in a rocky hollow, the cave looks like a natural formation from the outside. Inside, it is anything but natural. The Cuckoo's Nest is where the discarded end up. Everywhere you look, there are signs that awful things happened here. 5 makeshift graves sit just below the slope leading up to the entrance. Is it possible the Lobotomites still adhere to the ritual of burial, however crude? That's spooky in itself. The interior is a circular cavern split by a central outcropping, every surface cluttered with debris. Corpses lie in heaps, makeshift bedding is strewn across the dirt, filthy mattresses dragged here by Lobotomites who treat this cave as a kind of communal den. The piles of scrap metal, torn wiring and rusted household junk make the whole chamber feel like a hoarder's nightmare. But the horror isn't in the clutter itself, it's the fact that these mindless shells collected this stuff for some reason. They carried it here with a purpose only they understand, forming a grotesque nest built entirely out of the remnants of trash. Hanging from an IV stand beside a surgical table are dolls, crude and childlike. Their placement next to surgical equipment suggests they were hung there as comfort items for Lobotomites who retain only the faintest shadow memory of what humanity looked like. The effect is pretty chilling. And then there is the shrine. Near the entrance sits a shelf stacked with dozens of old-world toasters arranged almost reverently around a single object, the Toaster Sync Project holotape. Were the Lobotomites worshipping this? The Lobotomites that patrol the cavern are violent, but it is test subject 1 who stands out. This is a unique specimen, presumably the very first Lobotomite, yet another former human twisted by experimentation but far stronger than the usual common variety. If most big empty locations are terrifying because of the bizarre experiments that happened there, whether technological or biological, the Cuckoo's Nest is unnerving because of its raw, unfiltered decay. A communal grave for the half-dead, a nest of broken minds, a space where the last fragments of humanity in the big empty rot alongside piles of useless junk. We're looking next at the mysterious cave. This cave is, in comparison to a lot of the other locations in the Big Empty, pretty bare, seemingly a pocket of untouched geology sitting inside the most engineered landscape in the Mojave, but don't let that fool you. The layout mirrors the Brockflower Cave from the base game, but stripped of torches, barrels, anything that might orient you. The moment you step inside, there's a weirdly oppressive feel. And something strange that survived in here might be creating that feeling. The cave's left branch widens into a large chamber, quiet and empty until movement stirs at the far end. The legendary bloatfly, one of the most insanely lethal creatures in New Vegas, resides here. A grotesquely oversized insect whose speed, armor and damage output make it feel like a boss fight. And actually, maybe even beyond that. There is nothing explaining why it grew to this size. No logs, no notes, no cages, no spilled mutagens. It simply exists in a dark recess of the Big Empty. It's a pretty terrifying encounter. The open chamber offers little cover, and the moment the creature spots the courier, it darts with shocking precision, firing projectiles with extreme accuracy. If you can manage to kill the creature, the body of the legendary bloatfly actually does offer some clues as to what might have caused it to become so lethal. Loaded with psycho and buff out as well as empty syringes, its corpse implies that these items combined to mutate it into something almost unstoppable. Yet, even that raises questions. Who left so many chems here and why? As with everything in the mysterious cave, implications are there in lieu of any concrete answers. All in all, it's a location defined by negative space. A cave with no history housing a creature with no context in the middle of a research facility where context is everything. It feels like an intentional gap in the Big Empty's narrative, a place whose horror comes from how unexplained it is. It's pretty much designed to knock you off balance, like a jump scare, so to speak. Now we're getting to my favourite parts of the Big Empty, the weirdest, creepiest of all. And of my favourites, the Securitron Deconstruction Plant may be one of the zaniest. Not because it's bloody or overrun with creatures, but because it feels wrong somehow to me. I'm not even sure I can properly describe why. I can just honestly tell you that when I first discovered it, I found it creepy as hell. Maybe I just find robots having a nervous breakdown particularly scary or something, I don't know. Anyway, the building sits behind a broken chain link fence with radioactive barrels and a collapsed sign that once read Automaton Deconstruction. Only 3 letters remain upright, D, R and O, spelling out Dr. O's name. By accident or by design, who knows? Whatever the case, there's a bit of visual storytelling there beyond the connection to the Robco-hating Dr. O, a facility meant to strip machines apart, now falling apart itself. Inside it gets properly weird. On the upper platform patrols one of the strangest enemies in the entire add-on, a Securitron whose name is literally binary code. All the robots here are erratic or berserk as the case may be, but this one is singular, which is fitting because the binary code literally translates to 1. It's a lot bigger than the other Securitrons and it has shoulder-mounted missiles. There's something about one and the other Securitrons that makes them super creepy to me. It's the fact that there's no explanation for the state they've ended up in. Can robots go insane? Their weird, distorted faces add to it. What caused that? They look completely crazy. Dr. O's intercom warnings that we are reading increased levels of berserkity are played for humour, but inside the plant they ring completely true. These Securitrons are wrong in every way, just wrong. What happened to them? Were they tortured? Because they seem like half lobotomized machines that should have been switched off long ago. The Uncanny Valley vibe here is intensified because the enemies are familiar to players. Securitrons are everywhere in New Vegas, but these ones have gone feral. And no wonder, the place feels like a morgue for robots. Imagine you were trapped in a morgue, you'd probably go insane too. Whatever the case may be, these machines aren't hostile because they're programmed to be, they're hostile because they're breaking down in some way, and that's scary. The think tank seemingly abandoned them, possibly after putting them through God knows what. Dr. O lost interest. Nothing here has been maintained, only dismantled, torn apart, and basically left to glitch out madly until the end of time. Well, until you come along and put them all down. And now we come to my most loved / hated place in the entirety of the Big Empty. The most liminal, the most haunting. Higgs Village is the place that feels the most wrong. And it isn't because it's dangerous, far from it. In fact, the lack of danger adds to the freakiness of the place. The quiet but fading, rotting but somehow perfect, pristine replica of pre-war suburbia sealed inside a warehouse lets the uncanny feeling just sit with you like a promise of something horrifying just around the corner. It is a cul-de-sac with no sky, no wind, no life. A pocket of civilization embalmed but somehow decaying. The moment you pass through the warehouse entrance, the space feels unreal. The Big Empty's landscape is insane, but it's alive. Higgs Village is the quiet of death. Seriously, it feels like a funeral home. 6 houses stand in a circle around a dead fountain, each home labelled with a number, each completely frozen in time. It is a stage set built to imitate domestic normality but deprived of all the things that make a neighbourhood feel alive. There are no footsteps, no doors creaking, no ambient sounds, just the wind. This is where the think tank members lived before they discarded their bodies. Their brains still speak with mad confidence, but in Higgs Village you get to see the physical evidence of their past selves. They used to be human, and these houses hold the fragments of who they were. The horror here is subtler than in any other part of the Big Empty. There are no enemies save for Stripe, a miniature Deathclaw who appears with Wild Wasteland. No alarms, no traps. The dread comes from the immaculate stillness, nothing moves unless you move it. The unnatural lighting, a sense of permanent twilight, like the space between life and death, sort of where the think tank members themselves exist. There are frozen domestic scenes, tables set, hallways decorated, bedrooms arranged as if their owners will walk back in any second, a bit like the Mary Celeste. The think tank simply walked away from their lives, leaving them preserved and partly intact. It's like walking into the bedroom of someone deceased, left exactly as they left it, years later but caked in layers of dust. But as we'll see, there are parts where it seems they may have returned to Higgs Village post-transformation, and frustratedly tried to reconnect with their past selves, leaving chaotic scenes behind them. Whatever the case, Higgs Village is liminal in the truest sense, a place designed for living that no longer has living inhabitants. And because it's indoors, the effect is suffocating. There is no open sky, no horizon, no sense of weather or time. You feel suspended, just like the environment itself. What makes it even more unsettling is that every house reflects a specific broken personality. House 000 is a funeral shrine to Dr. O's hatred of Robco. 2 Securitrons lie dismantled inside like abandoned cadavers. Scrap metal and broken circuitry coat the floor, but the creepiest detail is the portrait of Mr. House in the kitchen, stabbed repeatedly with knives through the head and torso. Everything in this house is skewed, the appliances gutted, the shelves overloaded with robot remnants, the upstairs Securitron slumped as if simply powered down and never rose again. It feels haunted by resentment. House 101 was Klein's abode, wine bottles everywhere, mentats stacked in odd corners. This house radiates intellectual burnout, the clutter of someone too consumed by his own mind to maintain his surroundings. A bit like Einstein if he went insane. And then we have House 102, which is Mobius's former abode. The interior is filled with computer monitors, mismatched equipment, and more mentats than any sane person should possess. The symmetry of addiction is everywhere. Pills on desks, pills on the stairs, pills by the bed. On the roof, a skeleton sits in a chair, 2 bottles of beer beside it, facing outward as if watching the skyline long after death. The lack of context adds to the weirdness. You are intruding into a story where you can see the ending, but it doesn't make any sense. Next we have House 103, Boris's place. The backyard rocket, Gabe's doghouse, the Brock flowers, it starts pretty wholesome. Then the house betrays its owner. Inside are empty bird cages, the upstairs floor marked with a knife driven into a note that says Dad. It feels immediately invasive, like you've stepped into someone's unprocessed childhood trauma. And then you find the basement. Boris's basement is one of the most disturbing rooms in Fallout. Dissected teddy bears, surgical tables, metal cages holding stuffed animals stabbed with butter knives. It's a room where someone projected their grief and obsession onto objects meant for comfort. The weird silence of Higgs Village juxtaposed with these scenes only adds to the intensity of this house feeling like the visual representation of an open wound. Then we have House 104, Dalla's bizarre getaway where a domestic space has been transformed into a stage. Mannequins, cameras, poles, broken mirrors, teddy bears arranged as an audience watching a performance that will never happen. The horror here is psychological. Dalla wanted to understand human sensation, intimacy, aesthetics, and built herself a theatre for it. Walking through this house is like stepping through someone's subconscious. And then we have House 108, which belongs to, you guessed it, Dr. 8. 8 of everything, precisely placed, perfectly aligned. Coffee mugs, plates, glasses, clocks, radios, all arranged in patterns that feel almost ritualistic. Higgs Village inspires uncomfortable feelings in me because it's an example of a specific kind of horror. The liminal horror of an abandoned space representing abandoned lives. Everything here was chosen, arranged, and lived in by the think tank before they became what they are now. These houses are partly time capsules of a discarded humanity, and the confused humanity that remained and revisited to wreak chaos in these abodes was unhinged. Every Mentat bottle, every broken robot, every teddy bear, every clock is a piece of a life shattered, with mad half-dead robots seemingly trying to piece it back together from the shards. Higgs Village is as much intimate horror as it is liminal. Its stillness is oppressive but gentle. Its revelations about the think tank members feels like something you're not supposed to see, something private, to be shared by the person themselves if they so chose. And yet, there you are, able to see it and take in the bleakness without any of the outside madnesses of the big empty to distract from the funereal feeling. 10 out of 10 for creepiness from me. And finally, as I said at the start of the video, we're going to take a look at a piece of cut content, to me, one of the creepiest examples in the entire Fallout franchise. The cut ending slides, known as Failure 08, is astonishing and, dare I say, apocalyptic. It transforms the Big Empty from an isolated and contained nightmare into an extinction event, a chain reaction of experiments breaking free and rewriting entire regions of the Mojave. What survived in the game files, some slide art, plus Chris Avalone's released narration, paints a version of the DLC where the courier fails to contain the think tank, ostensibly joining them, and the consequences spread outward like an epidemic of madness. It starts out with a strange glowing field of blue emanating from the Big Empty. This blue field is ambiguous, electrical, dimensional, temporal. All we know is that it expands across the Big Empty like a storm front. And then came floating spheres across the desert, apparently flickering like rainbow torches. A mysterious description of some kind of unknown phenomenon, something unleashed by the Big Empty. What comes next turns the Mojave into a list of horrors, each one tied directly to failed Big Mountain technologies. Good Springs is annihilated instantly, crushed beneath hexcrete blocks that stack to the sky, a direct echo of the X66 archipelago's strange geometric pillars. The material that never worked inside the Big Empty suddenly works too well, manifesting spontaneously and catastrophically. Prim fares no better, its people wink out of existence, leaving behind X-ray silhouettes, a horrifying visual image of instantaneous obliteration. Arms raised, mid-gesture, frozen in surrender. Jacobstown becomes the site of a fallen satellite broadcasting equations into Nightkin minds. A parody of scientific enlightenment that instead causes psychosis or paralysis. Black Mountain erupts with man-eating battle Brahmin, while the radio station broadcasts staccato static. Camp Searchlight becomes a garden of giant carnivorous plants, presumably the ones also seen in Vault 22. And, absolutely bizarrely, the Colorado River shrugs. That single word is devastating despite being so casual. The river changes course like a creature stretching, drowning towns as if adjusting its posture. Gomorrah becomes host to a vegetation-based STD that causes its victims to burst like seed pods. Lovely. Caesar's Legion East is brain-scrubbed, rebuilt into people who believe they are citizens of ancient Rome, but on the moon. The NCR doesn't escape either. The entirety of it, yes, the entire NCR, becomes trapped in a perpetual simulation. A nationwide tranquility lane, a reference to Vault-Tech's neurological experiments. Identity, history, and agency are erased in favour of a looping false utopia. Each of these is a failure condition for the player. You didn't stop the think tank. Without intervention, all their sealed experiments spill outwards. But also, I guess it's a success outcome for the player if you decide to join the think tank and this is what happens. So, you could look at it either way. Whatever the player decided to do, of course, the think tank sees none of this as a disaster. They simply see data. They see experiment results. They marvel at the possibilities, convinced this unfolding apocalypse was waiting for them to discover it. Their worldview is so warped they interpret mass suffering as scientific success. The Mojave becomes a proving ground for their so-called progress. If it had remained in the final DLC, Failure 08 would have been one of the darkest endings in Fallout history. It confirms several things were considered by the writers. The Big Empty is not contained, only dormant. Their technology is world-altering, not niche. The think tank lacks the morality to understand catastrophe, and without the courier stopping them, the Mojave has the potential to become a post-scientific wasteland where logic, biology, and physics break down. The think tank's madness is survivable while they are trapped in the Big Empty, but the moment someone lets them loose, intentionally or otherwise, the moment they are given a world to improve, everything becomes a disastrous experiment, and nothing is sacred. So why do I think Old World Blues is the creepiest New Vegas DLC? Well, when you pull back from the tour and look at the Big Empty as a whole, you can really see how many different flavours of horror it manages to cram into one DLC. We've seen it in all the examples I've covered throughout the video, and I really don't have to summarise them. I genuinely feel like it's one of the most complete kaleidoscopes of horror I've ever seen. So when I say that the Big Empty is the creepiest place in Fallout New Vegas, I made this video, I've come with receipts. Nowhere else in the franchise hits every axis of horror at once. Flesh turned into tools, minds shattered and looped, spaces that feel like they've slipped out of reality, and the constant sense that if you weren't here to slam the door shut, the entire world would already be wearing a trauma harness. The Mojave has ghosts, cults, ghouls, haunted vaults, and cursed casinos, sure, but the Big Empty is a purer kind of contained horror. An entire landscape built out of potential dread, just waiting to break free.